Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. Today we're wrapping up all the books I read in December, and I think that was actually my best reading month of 2025. I read a total of 9 books, 8 of which were for Reindeer Readathon, and I really enjoyed pretty much everything I read. I think I had a lot of 4.5-star reads, at least one 5-star, and it was just overall a really great reading month. It did kind of taper off at the end of the month because we were visiting family and I just didn't have as much reading time, but overall I feel like it was a really successful month. So we're going to dive straight into the books because we have several to talk about, but I have talked about several of these, actually most of them, in vlogs as well. So I'm going to try and keep things pretty short and sweet here, and I'll direct you to those vlogs if you want to hear any of my more in-depth thoughts on any of these books. So first things first, I finished Backdraft by Cole McCade. This is book 10, I believe, in season 1 of Criminal Intentions. It's a book series that's structured like a TV show, and I am really enjoying this one. We're pretty far into the romance portion of the book. It's sort of like if Criminal Minds had a queer romance at the heart of it. So we're following Malcolm and Songjay, who are two detectives in Baltimore who sort of get into a relationship with each other throughout the course of the series. In this particular installment, it's actually about an officer-involved shooting where a man was apparently killed, or appears to have been killed, but he's like disappeared, and so they're trying to investigate because one of the officers involved is related to one of the internal affairs officers who's supposed to be investigating the case. So there's like a conflict of interest. They get called in instead to act as like impartial observers, and they're trying to figure out what's going on because it looks like the officers are hiding something. It looks like internal affairs is hiding something. So they're kind of dealing with corruption within the police department and trying to navigate how to investigate without getting in trouble, while also trying to navigate their relationship, because again, it was pretty far into the romance at this point. And I really enjoyed this installment. I thought that the mystery was really strong. I liked that you kind of know from the start who is involved and what's happened, but they have to figure out how to prove what's happened because there's like missing evidence and they can't find the body, and there's all of these different pieces that they're trying to like figure out so that they can actually ensure that justice is done. So I really liked that part of it. The romance in this one, I think it's a little bit on the melodramatic side. So this is where my rating of the book came down a little bit, because I think that some of the romance scenes were a little bit long-winded. There were a lot of moments where it was kind of in Songjay's head or Malcolm's head, and we're getting these sort of internal monologues that would just go on a little bit too long. They were a little overly melodramatic, but I did think that the overall trajectory of their relationship is interesting because they're both trying to navigate, like, how do I be in a committed relationship with someone? Songjay is just not used to that. He's not had, like, a healthy committed relationship like this before, and then Malcolm has been in a relationship before, but he feels like he really screwed up the previous time around. His previous marriage ended in part because he had kind of pushed his partner away. He was not emotionally available, and so now he's trying to correct course for that, but there's also the risk that he pushes his new partner away because he's being like overbearing. So I really liked that conflict in the relationship at this stage. I thought that was an interesting thing for them to be navigating. This had one of my favorite scenes for the romance where Songjay gets to meet Malcolm's parents, and it's a really sweet scene. Really enjoyed that part of it. I just felt like there were some moments here that got a little bit overly long, a little bit overly dramatic, that kind of dragged down the pace of the book a little bit. Second book I finished was The Golden Raven by Nora Sakavic. This is book 5 overall in the All for the Game series. It's the second book. Sorry, I started coughing. I'm recovering from the flu. I've been fine for a while now, but I have a lingering cough, so bear with me as that might happen a little bit throughout this video. But this is the second book in the Jean Moreau spin-off series from the original All for the Game trilogy. And I think this is a step up from the first of the spin-offs. The first spin-off, The Sunshine Court, had a really strong first half and then suffered in the last half because of its kind of stepping away from the theme of consent that was so prevalent in the original trilogy, and a lot of The Sunshine Court is Jean being forced to tell people things that he is not ready to talk about, and people just kind of not giving him the space to process his emotions. So I really didn't like The Sunshine Court, or at least the second half of The Sunshine Court, and I think this was a course correction for the spinoff, because this one is a lot more about Jean's development of friendships with various people on the Trojan XE team, which is the team he's on now, and he's building his friendships, he's getting to know his roommates better, and a lot more of this book was people giving Jean emotional support without expecting him to, like, open up entirely. They gave him a lot more space to be himself and to process things and to come to them when he was ready to talk about things. So I felt like this book was a lot stronger. That said, this sort of spin-off series is leaning a lot more towards a romance than the original trilogy did. There is a romance in the original trilogy. This one, I think, is more directly leaning in that direction, and the romance is the least interesting relationship that Jean is developing. We learn a lot more about Jeremy and his sort of tragic backstory, but his tragic backstory just seems so flat in the face of everything that Jean has faced that ultimately, like, that relationship was the least interesting, and I was much more invested in the friendships that Jean was developing with some of the other players, particularly Cody, I think was my favorite. That was my favorite of the friendships. So yeah, stronger than book 1 in the spinoff, but definitely still a Nora Sakovic book. Nothing makes sense, and you just kind of have to roll with it. After that, I finished Murder at the Black Cat Cafe by Taishi Okumizo, and this one has 2 stories in it, actually. It's got the titular Murder at the Black Cat Cafe, and it also has a story in it called Why Did the Wheel Well Creak? And I mentioned that specifically because I didn't really care for the titular story. I think that it's a little bit overly convenient. You get a lot of investigation for the first 90 pages of the story. It's 140 pages, and the last 50 are just a character who has not been involved at all just showing up and being like, actually, I figured out the story already, and you don't have anyone that you can ask to confirm anything because everybody's dead. And I didn't really care for that because I thought that he was making some pretty wild logical leaps, especially in terms of motive from characters who were, again, dead and so could not speak for themselves. So I really didn't care for that resolution for Murder at the Black Cat Cafe. But Why Did the Wheel Well Creak has a very different format. We're following a family where a young man within the family has recently returned from World War II, and the family dynamic has changed pretty dramatically. There's also a lot of feuds that this family has with other people in the small village that they live in. So that's the context for the story, and the whole thing is told from the perspective of a young woman who's the youngest sister of this family, who is writing letters to her brother, one of her brothers, who is off in a tuberculosis asylum. And so she is trying to piece things together herself, although she is also ill and is, limited in where she can go physically within space and who she can interact with. And so she is using her kind of narrow access to the rest of the family to try and figure out what's going on, because there's some questions of identity, and there's some questions of fidelity, infidelity. There's some aspect of that in here. It's just interesting. It's a very messy family drama, and I liked that the detective character for that story is somebody within that family trying to figure out what the hell is happening. The last book I read in that first vlog that I did for Reindeer Readathon, I did a 2-part vlog for the readathon. That last book was Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie, and this book had me in a chokehold the whole time I was reading it. This is my 5-star for the month. I absolutely loved this. It's been probably 2 years since I read The Blade itself, and yet because the world and the characters are so distinctive, I had no trouble just diving straight back into this and continuing on where I left off. I really love all of our characters, but I think my favorite storylines in this were Glock does, because he's got a political intrigue thing going on. He's kind of involved in various political investigations, so I really enjoyed that. And then Jezel, I think, goes through some really fascinating character development in this. He's sort of that character you love to hate in the first book. He's really an asshole. But in this book, I think he goes through some interesting experiences that change him as a person in really interesting ways. And he went from being my favorite character to hate to maybe being one of my favorite characters. So I really was excited to see that character growth for him. And I'm really intrigued to see how the last book of the series is going to wrap up. The series doesn't really have a clear plot that I can tell you. It's just political intrigue and people being moved around pieces on a chessboard, and I am so excited to see how it's all going to play out because I have no idea where the story is ultimately going to go. Moving into that part 2 vlog, the first book I read for that one was Snake Eater by T. Kingfisher, which I think I read marketed as horror, but I would say this is more firmly fantasy with some light horror elements. This is following a young woman named Selena who ends up moving to a small desert town trying to flee her current partner. Their relationship has soured pretty dramatically as she is starting to see some of her self-worth and kind of get out of his sort of manipulative control, and she ends up in this small desert town and finds out that her aunt, who she'd been going to visit, has passed away, and she now has her aunt's house and is just trying to take up life in this remote, isolated place with a small community of people who support her in ways that she wasn't expecting. I really enjoyed the directions the story went, and I don't really want to tell you what the plot is, because I think that my enjoyment of the story was dented slightly by knowing where this is going and kind of what the magical element of the story was, because this book has a lot of build-up. You kind of have to see Selena start to adjust to life in the desert and start to trust the people around her and start to have a little more confidence in her own abilities throughout the first part of the book before we get into the conflict in the later part of the book. So I think not knowing what that particular magic element is maybe a little bit better for the reading experience of this one. That said, I really enjoyed this. I had so much fun. There is a lot of build-up. It's a little bit slow in the first half, but I think that it totally pays off, that build-up. And my only quibble with it was that there is a clear parallel between Selena's former partner and another character in the story that is connected to the main theme of the story, which the book is very much about, like, abusive relationships, and I really wanted it to dig more into that parallel and dig more into that theme, and I feel like it just didn't get into that conversation as much as I think it could have or should have. So that was my only real issue with the story, and I overall loved this. I laughed, I cried, I grinned like an idiot most of the time I was reading it, and it gave me all the emotions, full range of them. I was on like a little roller coaster with this one, and I think it's one of my favorite T. Kingfisher books that I've read. After that, I continued on to read my one nonfiction of the month, which was Henry V by Dan Jones, and I ended up picking up the audiobook for this, and absolutely loved the audiobook. The author reads it himself, and I think he does a fantastic job. This is a really accessible and engaging history book. It's about Henry V's life, but it has this very clear focus, where in the first half of the book, we're looking at the experiences that Henry had from the time that his father became king. Like, it starts earlier than that, but this is what it's really interested in. The experiences he had from the moment his father became king when he was like 12 or 13, up until the moment where Henry himself became king in his 20s, and the experiences he had during that time period that prepared him to take on the role of king. The things that he learned about how to wage war, how to finance wars, but also how to, like, manage the financial health of the nation. There were all of these different things that he learned, and then in the second half, we're looking at his time as king and seeing how those lessons he learned earlier in his life can be seen playing out in the actual actions that he took as King of England. So I found that really interesting, and I liked that that trajectory helped keep the book pretty focused, and it never felt like I was just being thrown names and dates and, like, things to remember. So I really enjoyed this, and I will definitely be reading more from Dan Jones. I actually have another of his books on my shelf that I'd like to get to, but I had a much better time with this than I was anticipating, and I would highly recommend the audiobook for this one. I then read another audiobook because I needed one for an audiobook bonus prompt, and I read The Legacy of Arniston House by T.L. Huchu. I've been really enjoying the audiobooks for this series. I do tend to struggle with audiobooks, but the narrator for the Edinburgh Nights series is just really dynamic and engaging. She's really great at kind of keeping my attention, and I have no problem whatsoever with the audiobooks for this series, so I have been enjoying reading them that way. I enjoyed this. I don't think it's the best book in this series. In fact, I think it's my least favorite in the series, but The Worst Edinburgh Nights book is still, like, a really damn good book. I still had a fantastic time with this. I think the issue that this book had was it doesn't have a central mystery in quite the same way that the first 3 books in the series do, where there's, like, an overarching plot, obviously, but each book has its own sort of central mystery that gives Ropa something to work towards. This particular installment, it sort of has a mystery, but it's not Ropa kind of trying to solve something so much as it is Ropa ping-ponging between dramatic events and sort of reacting to things. It feels like she's constantly on the back foot in this one. She never really gets to use her skills and, like, gain information through, like, active investigation. It's just a thing happens, Ropa reacts to it, she flees. A thing happens, Ropa reacts to it, she flees. And so I felt like a lot of the book suffered for that. It made it feel kind of repetitive, and I wanted more of Ropa actually getting to do things. I did like a lot of the reveals we get here, because we get a lot of really important information about that overarching plot. We learn a lot more about some of our major characters and how they're tied to each other, and I enjoyed there's, like, a really big betrayal in here that I think is really interesting, and there's also some new information that Ropa gets about her family that I really enjoyed as well. So again, it's still a really good book. It's just, I think, the weakest overall in the series up to this point, but I am excited for the things that it's set up for the final book. It's left off in a very dramatic place, and I'm curious to see how Ropa is going to get out of this particular conundrum. So that was the conclusion of my part 1 and part 2 Rain to Readathon vlogs, and I did end up reading one more book for Rain to Readathon, but in the meantime, I took a little pause and I finished a book for my workbook club because I knew we were having our book club meeting and I wanted to be ready for that, and we read Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This really surprised me how much I enjoyed it. I had never really been particularly interested in any of Taylor Jenkins Reid's premises. They'd never really appealed to me, but of her books, this is one that seemed the most like it's something I could enjoy because I do like space, I like astronomy, I think that space exploration is really cool. So this one is about a woman becoming a NASA astronaut during the 70s and 80s and about the sexism she faced in doing that. It's also about the relationships she developed as a part of that program, the people that she met, the friends that she made, and the things that she learned about herself along the way. I really ended up enjoying this, and I think that it does a really good job of maintaining some tension because we have 2 timelines. We have the one timeline of Joan becoming an astronaut and going through training and developing all of those friendships with the people around her. And then we have another timeline that is sort of the like present day timeline for the story. It's in the 1980s, I think 84. And there is a catastrophe happening. And Joan is in the communication seat for this particular mission as this disaster is playing out. And she is having to be that like point of contact for the people who are in space as they're navigating this difficult situation. And I really enjoyed that. I think it did a really good job of creating tension, and there were a lot of moments where you'd get a really sweet thing in the friendship development in the kind of past timeline, and then you would flick forward to the present timeline and see like the people that Joan has come to like know and love suffering in this like horrific way. So I felt like it was doing a lot of sort of emotional whiplash kind of moves that I actually felt like worked pretty well, and I had a good time with this. I significantly underestimated how much I would enjoy this book. I think my issue with this one was that there were a few moments where I felt like I was being hit over the head with a theme brick, because the book is in a lot of ways about the sexism that Joan faced as an astronaut trainee, as a woman in sort of that one of the earliest cohorts of astronauts that allowed women to apply. So she's one of a very few women who are involved, and there's a lot of pressure on them to do well because they're sort of laying the foundations for women astronauts yet to come. And I really, I like that theme. I think it's really important, and I think it was interesting the way that the book was discussing the sexism that women face in male-dominated industries. But there were a lot of conversations and a lot of moments that felt a little bit artificial and felt like the author just kind of like smacking you over the head with the theme. Like, do you get it? Do you get what I'm talking about? And I was like, yes, I do. I understand. You don't have to hit me that hard with a brick. So that was my one issue with the book, but overall I did really enjoy this, and I think that Taylor Jenkins Reid's writing is just really immersive and really engaging. Like, I was so enthralled with the story the whole time I was reading it. This was another one I ended up, I think, also getting the audiobook for it and listening to part of it so that I could get through it in time for book club, and this was another really great audiobook, so I was really killing it with audiobooks this month too. But yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed this, way more than I anticipated. The final book I read in December was one that I bought while we were visiting my partner's parents. We did a little bit of book shopping, and I bought this one book, and I was able to swap it in for a Rain to Readathon prompt that I hadn't yet completed, and it's The Flesh King by Richard Kadrey. This is the second book in the Discreet Eliminator series, and it's following Ford and Newland, who are these two mercenaries. Ford is alive, and he only kills the dead, and Newland is a revenant, and he only kills the living. They also have a new friend in this particular book, someone they meet in the first book who has sort of joined their team. Her name is Tilda, and I absolutely loved how much of this book was about Tilda's developing friendships with Ford and Newland and the way that they supported her in gaining new skills and approaching new hobbies that she was interested in. A lot of the book is about that friendship and the ways that that friendship changes them all for the better. I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. This is a paranormal investigation thing, because Ford and Newland are mercenaries, and this one they're trying to hunt down the Flesh King. They've been told that if they do that, they will be back in with the criminal underworld of New York City. But the book isn't really about that in a lot of ways, and I think it makes for a really interesting tone and feeling to the story, because again, so much of it is about the relationships and the friendships between Ford and Newland and Tilda. I really enjoyed that aspect of the story. I do think that means that the paranormal investigation portions felt a little bit rushed, particularly at the end, because we get a lot of buildup about how big and scary and difficult to defeat this guy is going to be, and then I feel like that final battle just goes by way too quickly. So it felt like we had all this buildup, and it was like, oh, that was it? That was all you had to do to defeat him? That was pretty easy. Okay. Whatever, I guess. The paranormal investigations suffer a little bit from how much this book wants to talk about the friendships. But I really like the friendship, so I kind of don't care that much. It was still like a 4.5-star read for me. I read this really quickly. I really enjoyed it. And I'm excited to read more about Ford Newland and Tilda in the future. I would read probably as many Discreet Illuminators books as Richard Kadrey wants to write. So, these are all the books I read in December. Let me know down in the comments below what you read in December and what your favorite thing you read was, or something that really stuck with you, whether you liked it or not. Also, let me know if you've read any of these and what your thoughts were on them. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you'll consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting at least once a week, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.